Tiffany of TipStitched, and this is my very first sew along video. We are going to be sewing the Kommatia pattern Ferri Bodysuit. Now this is a pattern company I hadn't heard of, but I stumbled upon them on my Instagram feed and I really loved the look of this bodysuit. It features raglan sleeves in sort of a dolman style. It features a wider neckline and it features this blouson or blousey loose fitting top. The problem that I was having with a lot of bodysuits that was coming out this season has been that they've been really fitted bodysuits that you tuck into either slim pants or a pencil skirt or jeans. And I put on a few pounds, to be honest, and I just didn't feel the most confident. I mean, if you do, rock it, wear it, do your thing. But I personally didn't feel really confident in those very snug bodysuits that have been coming out this season. I love them, especially for others. They just weren't for me, not right now. So the thing that attracted me about this bodysuit was this looser fit in the stomach waist area and in the bust. It's an easy breezy kind of top. I feel like you could dress it up or dress it down depending on the materials you use. You could use a stretch velvet maybe and bring it a little bit dressier, or what I actually used for this one was a wool jersey, so it's comfortable and warm for these cooler winter months we've been having in the southeast this year. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's go over what you're going to need for this sew along. First and foremost, you're going to need the Ferri pattern by Kommatia Patterns. You can purchase this from KommatiaPatterns.com. I'll link to it below in the description. I'll also put up a pop-up so you can see the line drawing a little bit better here. As of this taping in February 2018, this pattern is $7.95, so it's really not that bad. It is a PDF pattern by Indie Company, so this is going to mean you're going to need the tape and cut for your assembly for your pattern. But this bodysuit doesn't take up a lot of fabric or paper, so it prints out on just 11 sheets of paper, whether that's letter size or A4 for those who are outside of the United States. You can also send in a special request with your order for the A0 size paper pattern, and that is the one that you can either send to a print shop online or your local print shop and have printed for you on a big 24 by 36 inch sheet of paper. I typically recommend that for larger patterns that have more pieces, because for me it's just easier than taping and cutting 60 some sheets of paper. But like I said, this pattern is only 11 sheets of paper, so it's really not that bad at all. You're also going to need about 1.5 yards. I think the pattern calls for exactly 1 3/8 yards. I just always like to buy a tad bit extra. So 1 3/8 yards of 4-way knit fabric. And you need 4-way, not really for the body. You could get away for 2-way stretch fabrics on the body, but you need the 4-way for the brief portion of the bodysuit to fit on your bum. You're also going to need some elastic to close up your leg holes, and you're going to need either 1/4 knit elastic. This you can typically buy in your local stores in either black or white, or you can use the specialty clear elastic as well that looks like this. The clear elastic is definitely a little bit pricey, but more pricey. I mean, they're both cheap, it's just elastic, but if you prefer a cleaner look on the inside, you might prefer the clear, because again, this typically only comes in black and white, maybe a nude. So if you're concerned about seeing that inside your garment, you may want to go with the clear. You're also going to need your typical basics, so that includes either your fabric scissors as well as paper scissors that I don't have out, or you can use a rotary cutter if that's your preference. You also are going to need your pattern weights. I just use washers that I've covered with ribbon, and you're going to need pins. And that's about it. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to try to follow along fairly closely with the instructions that are given with this pattern, even though they're a little bit different than the way that I would typically sew a raglan sleeve pattern. But for those of you who would like to follow along and learn how to read pattern instructions a little bit better, we're going to go ahead and sew it like they suggest. So this is going to be your front or your back, either way. They're the same piece. You're going to take your front piece, let's say, and you're going to attach it to your sleeve. So for this, you're going to take one sleeve and you're going to line up the edge. So this is your sleeve with the top at the top and the bottom at the bottom. You're going to take one side of your sleeve, the right side, and you're going to pin it to the side of the front. You're going to do the same thing with your second sleeve. by opening it up and taking the right side and pinning this long edge, that's the edge along the front of your sleeve, to the side of this front body piece. So you're going to go ahead and you're going to want to pin those sides together. If you have clamps, you can use clamps as well. I'm a pin girl. There's a notch here at the bottom. You're going to pin at that notch, and then I pinned at the top. You can also pin somewhere in the middle. You're going to repeat that for the other side. You should start with the notch. Then you can line up the top and put another pin in the middle. If you like more pins, go ahead and place a few more, but these 3 should probably do it for me. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew these 2 edges together to create the front of your bodysuit, where this is the body and here is the sleeve. If you are new to sewing knits, I'm going to give you a few tips. The first tip is always choose the right needle, and that's not just for knit fabrics, but it is an important part. You want to use a knit needle, which is indicated here on the Singer package with the yellow color, and you're going to use the right weight needle or gauge needle for the weight fabric that you're using. I'm using a fairly heavy knit, so I'm going to want to use a higher number needle, and for this it's going to be the size 100 or size 16 needle. Again, I'm using the knit one, so that one's indicated in yellow. I like Singer needles because I like their color coding system, so I typically buy these. And if you're a little confused about what weight you're using or which needle you should use, they do have a little instruction guide on the back of all their packaging. I also have run out of these ballpoint needles, who I can't remember who they were by, but you're either looking for a knit needle, a jersey needle, or a ballpoint needle when you're sewing knits. If you're sewing like bathing suit fabric, something nylon and stretchy, then you're going to want a stretch knit, which you could use here as well, but either one of these will work fine. And like I said, make sure you use the right weight. If you're experiencing skipped stitches, that's typically an indication of a dull needle, so make sure that you're changing your needles with every 1 or 2, maybe 3 projects, depending on the side of your project. Another thing that you're going to want to do is use your zigzag stitch on your machine. Hopefully I can get this zoomed in so you can see the labeling on my machine. My zigzag stitch is number 3, and it looks like a little zigzag, lightning bolt if you will. That for me is stitch 3. I've changed it to 3, and you're going to want to change your stitch length to the longer length, like 2.5, 3, 3.5, depending on what your machine has, and a more narrow stitch. So I have mine set at 2. For this will allow you to have stretch in that seam, which is what you need with knit fabrics, because without that seam's ability to stretch, you're going to end up with pop threads and you're going to look like you're really wearing a homemade garment. So save yourself some time and do that to start off with. The other thing that you can definitely do is sew this with your serger, which is what I would typically do, but I know some people don't have sergers, so I want to start with what I know everybody will have, and that is their sewing machine. So once you have your correct needle, your thread threaded, you have your garment pinned, and you have you're ready to go and you're ready to start sewing. Another common problem people have when they start sewing with knits is the fabric getting caught underneath the plate here, where the needle pushes it down as the feed dogs aren't feeding it all the way through. An easy way to get around that is to use paper. You can just use regular copy paper that you may have laying around your house, cut it into strips, place it under the fabric. So you'll have your fabric and you'll place it under your fabric about an inch or so that it can get started on the paper as you continue your seam. Now once you finish sewing, you would just tear that off and you wouldn't be left with anything but a nice clean seam. I don't always have that problem, so most of the times I just go for it, but for the sake of showing you guys, I'm going to start with the paper. And you're just going to put it under your presser foot. Your seam allowance for this pattern is 1/2 inch. So you're going to line it up with that 1/2 inch gauge on your machine, and you're just going to begin to sew that seam together. You're going to remove your pins as you sew. You never want to sew over a pin. Now that you have that done, you can see how the zigzag stitch looks on the back. Hopefully you can also see it here on the front. It's just going to go back and forth in a lightning-like fashion. And then since you started off with this paper, all you have to do is pull the paper off. You might have some little bits left, but don't worry, this is also the inside of your garment. So once you tear that off, you have nothing left. You just have your nice seam for your side fabric, and you're going to do this for the other side in the other sleeve. Now that we've sewn both sleeves on, you're going to have your main body piece, which is here in the center, attached to a sleeve on one side and attached to a sleeve on another side. I hope you can see that in frame. Okay, so once you've done that, we're going to repeat this for the back. If this is the front, we're going to repeat this for the back. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your other front or back piece, you're going to open it up, right side facing your other fabric, and then you're just going to line it up with the sleeve edge that's free, the sleeve edge that you didn't just sew. And you're going to line up the notches at the base of that sort of underarm seam there. You're going to line up your notches and pin. And then you are going to line up the top edges and pin. And then I'm just going to add one more pin here in the center. You're going to repeat this for the other sleeve. So you've sewn this edge to the front. You're going to sew this opposite. So this one, you're going to sew this opposite edge to the other edge, right? So you have your notches here for your center front on your neckband. You're going to take that other edge and line it up with that edge of your sleeve. And then you're going to find the notches, line them up, and pin. And we're just going to repeat pinning it at the top and then pinning one more pin in the center. Line everything up and pin. Come to the center and pin. And now we're just going to do the same thing here, which is use the paper if you need to. Use your lightning stitch that is narrow but long, and sew these two edges together, or you can serge. So now your sleeves are attached to both sides. You have a sleeve on the right and you have a sleeve to your left, and you have your center bodice front and back caught in between. So then what you're going to do, I'm going to flip it inside out really quickly so you guys can see it from the other side. Right, so you have your front, your back, and like I said, your sleeve on one side and your sleeve on the other side. So what we're going to do next is go ahead and attach the neckband. So you're going to want to pick up the strip of fabric that you have for your neckband. You're going to fold it in half, right sides facing. Okay, so you'll have half the length. And then you're just going to sew this back edge together at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you're going to press it under your presser foot. You're going to line it up, make sure you keep it steady on this short piece of fabric, and just use that same, you can actually use a straight stitch for this because this won't stretch. So I'm just going to change to a straight stitch, and I'm just going to sew this shut. Okay, now you have a loop or a circle. Alright, so you're going to take this and you're going to fold it in half lengthwise, but this time wrong sides facing. So if you go to your ironing board and you press this seam so that it's nice and open and flat, then you're going to fold it in half so that inside seam faces itself. You can pin it if you need to keep that shut. And then you're going to go around to the half mark, which you should have a little notch, a little double notch there. You're going to fold those together. Again, wrong sides facing, not right this time. So the inside facing each other. You're going to take another pin. You can pin it there. You also have notches for your side seam or your shoulder seam. So you're going to take that and pin it. And for the other side seam, you're going to take that and pin it. Alright, so you should have 4 pins, and it should be splitting your loop in quarters. The front and back seam, the back being where the seam is. So the front and back, and then the 2 side points should be marked with pins. Now it's easy to go ahead and attach this to your bodysuit, bodice. So pulling that up, you're going to take that back seam, which, let me find it, is where the stitching line is. So you're going to take that back seam where you've sewn that shut, and you're going to center it in between the 2 notches that are on the back bodice piece. So center that right there. You remove that pin and pin it. Making sure that you don't get this all twisted up. Okay, take it around to the other side, the front bodice, where you'll have another double seam, and you're going to take the double snips that you have in the neckband, and you're going to line those up. So you'll see that there's a double stitch here, a double notch here, and you're going to line it up with this double notch here. Again, use that pin or get another one to pin it there. And then you have your shoulder side seams. So in the center of your shoulder seam, you have another notch, double notch. You're going to take that and center your notches there as well. You can remove that pin and pin it. And then we just have the one other side for the shoulder seam. You're going to take those notches or notch and line it up in between the center of the notches here and pin. Now I have all 4 corners pinned to the 4 not quarters, but not corners, sorry, but quarters of the bodice. So starting with the back seam, because I just like if there's going to be any mess, I like it to be right there at the back seam. I'm going to start there and sew the 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can do this with a straight stitch as well, because this neckband won't have to stretch to go over your head. It's a fairly wide neck, and you're going to sew around until you get back to itself with the straight stitch. So slide that under your machine, get it lined up to that 1/2 inch mark. If you feel like you need a few more pins to make sure that you keep everything together and even, do so. I can probably get away with just these 4. So that's what I'm going to do. But make sure that as you're sewing, you may have to stretch the neckband a little to keep it lined up with the bodice. Again, if pinning that in more places is easier for you, do that. You're going to start your stitch. You can back stitch, but you're going to come right back to that stitch. So keep on sewing at an even 1/2 inch seam allowance, getting my serge threads out of the way. Make sure that as you're going along, if you haven't used more pins, that you're keeping your bodice edge and your neckband edge even. Let me zoom in some so you can see a little better. Alright, so just continue all the way around, stretching the neckband as you go, removing the pins, keeping it at that 1/2 inch seam allowance. Just going to keep moving this fabric around. Now we're almost back to the beginning, and we just want to make sure that we stitch right on top of that stitching where we started, and then back stitch to secure it in place. You could have done that with a serger. I like to do this with a sewing machine just in case I do make an error or I get it off or I don't catch all the fabric. And so now you have a finished neckband attached to your bodice. What I do at this point is serge along this edge so that I don't have all these raw edges inside of my neckline. If you don't have a serger, you can certainly clean that up by cutting it close to the seam or finishing it with a zigzag stitch, because it's a knit and it's not going to unravel. But once you've done that, give it a good press. Press that extra seam allowance towards the bodice, and then you're going to go back around and you're going to top stitch. You're going to go back around and you're going to top stitch this down to keep it, but give it a good press first so it lays down nice and flat, and then you're just going to run it back through your sewing machine and top stitch along. So I'm going to give it a good press and I'll be right back. So I've gone ahead and serged my binding, my neckband here, just to have a nice clean edge, and that's just what I prefer since I do have a serger. And like I said, you're going to flip this over, give it a good press with your ironing machine or your steamer, and now we're going to top stitch or edge stitch along this edge to keep this neckband nice and standing up, not drooping and trying to fold out. So again, I'm going to start at the center back. If you have a tag, this is actually a nice time to add that as well. I always try to keep my labels handy so that I can sew them in. So at this point, you could take your tag and sew it to the center back before you tack the neckband down. I actually ordered these labels from Dutch Label Shop because I know you guys will want to know, and I actually really like their products. I haven't had any issues with them. I've ordered a couple of different labels and they've always met my satisfaction. These are the double folded top edge ones that I prefer because they just look a little nicer. Before these, I had some other woven labels. So these are custom because they actually have my logo on it. Let me see if I can get those in focus. Oh, come on, catch it. Alright, so these have my logo on them. I really love these. Like I said, they're the folded double over top edge. So I really like to sew these in. They look nice and finished. Before that, I had these woven labels that are not custom, they're just text. They were back when my blog was Frugy Fashionista. They're actually silver on gray, which probably wasn't the brightest idea, but I thought it would look nice and monochromatic, which it does. They're a lot easier to read in person than they are on camera. And then for my lovely Miss Socialite, my stepdaughter, for those of you who don't know, I bought these little labels, which are actually not labels, they are ribbon. Come on, catch it. Okay, well, it doesn't like it's going to catch it, but these are ribbon, a spool of ribbon that I bought, and I cut them off the ribbon roll and then sort of light the edges with the lighter so that they won't fray. And I attached these to her items because she needs her own special tag according to her. So I indulged her a bit and ordered these for her. This is sort of what they look like on the roll. They just come as the long roll. You can determine what length you want, and you can put an image as well as text on the ribbon. So that's what I did. Anyway, at this point you can sew on your tag. I like to switch to white thread when I do this because it just looks cleaner when I sew it on, and sometimes I hand stitch it, but because I don't want to change the color of my thread right now, we're going to skip this step and just go to top stitching. You're going to line up maybe just the inside of your presser foot right along the edge. Just make sure that it's close enough that you're catching the neckband as you're sewing through. Try to keep it nice and even. And it's going to be just like the neckband where you just continuously go around until you get back to where you started. This is some pretty heavy fabric, so excuse all the racket. Make sure that your seams are sort of flat as you're sewing over them. Once you've made it all the way back around, you're going to back stitch once you go over the seam where you started. So now your neckband will stay flush and lay flat instead of wanting to droop or flop. That's what that little bit of top stitching is for. So now you'll see that our top of our bodysuit is coming into shape. You can tell that it's a top now. We've attached both the right and left sleeve to the body, front and back of the tee, and we've attached the neckband by sewing the short edges together and then folding the wrong sides together and then pinning and attaching the neckband to the bodice and top stitching around that edge so that we capture the seam allowance on the other side, and that helps to keep this neckband flat. The last thing that we did was sew the entire side seam of the top from the edge of the sleeve all the way down and around to the edge or the bottom of the bodice, of the front and back bodice. So now we have that together, and we have the back marked by the fact that we have the center seam of the neckband there. So you have what essentially now just looks like a basic raglan sleeve t-shirt with sort of a dolman sleeve effect in the underarm. Now we're going to move on to the briefs. The briefs of the bodysuit are the front and back brief. You can tell the back because it's a little bit longer in the crotch area, and that's because this is the portion that folds up and back so that you can snap the front down. So you're going to have the back and you're going to have the front brief piece. You're just going to lay those on top of each other and align these edges. And it's sort of hard to see because they're the same color. Let me see if I have anything I can put underneath it to help it stand out a bit. Alright, so here's your front piece and your back piece of the briefs. Turn it this way. So like I said, the back piece is a little longer because when you wear a bodysuit, you need that piece to fold over so that they can snap in place together like so in the front where it's easier for you to reach. So the first step is to pin these side seams that you have here. There's no notch on the side, but it's a short seam, so you should be able to tell where your top should meet and your bottom should meet. And you're going to place 2 pins there, and then you're going to repeat that for the other side, making sure that you're lining up the bottom and the top. You can add an additional pin on that seam if you want, maybe in the center. Make sure that you keep everything together, but I will get by with just these 2. So I'm going to go ahead and sew or serge these 2 edges together using that 1/2 inch seam allowance. So as you can see now, I have serged both of the side seams for the briefs. Again, this is the front on top and the bottom or back underneath. And so once you have these side seams attached, what you're going to want to do is switch it so that the side seams meet in the middle, and you have the front piece on one side and the back piece on the other side. The only thing I do not like about this pattern is the fact that they do not tell you how much elastic you need to cut for these leg openings. Now it's pretty easy to follow because you are just going to want to use about the same length that you have for the opening. So again, like I said in the beginning, you can either use clear elastic, the specialty elastic from your local store. You can use fold over elastic, which is an option that they talk about in the pattern instructions. So with the fold over elastic, you would simply be taking the elastic and sandwiching the fabric in between it by folding it over, right? Fold over elastic and sewing along that edge all the way around. But I don't have any red fold over elastic. I actually think the fold over elastic is probably the easiest approach. But what I'm going to use instead of the clear elastic or the fold over is going to be this 1/4 inch knit elastic that I just got from my local Joann's. You could also use swimsuit or lingerie elastic, as that would be softer and feel a little bit better against the skin. But as you'll see in the next steps, this is going to be covered by fabric in the end anyway, so this elastic won't be touching you directly. So what you can do is take your tape measure and measure along this outside seam. So you're going to want to measure from the front to the back using your tape measure to find out what this total length is. And for this, because we're talking about elastic, it doesn't really have to be a precise number. Let me pull all of this tape measure out and untwist it. I'm sewing the large and I'm at about 27 inches. So again, if you just take this from one edge, spinning it around the corners, you can see what number you end up at for your size. Again, I'm making the large and I'm pretty much right at 27 inches. I just wanted to double check. So with that 27 inches, I would probably cut about 26 inches of whatever elastic that you're using, just so there is a little stretch in the fabric and need to snap back. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out and measure 1 inch less than what I measured with my tape measure, which would be 26 inches based on what I measured. And with my tape measure, measure that out. That is 26, so I will cut there. And I'll pull out enough elastic to cut one more because we have 2 leg openings. So you need 2 strips of elastic at whatever length you determined. So I'm just going to use my first piece of elastic as a guide instead of my tape measure. Line up those edges. Pull along till I get to the end and snap, so I have 2 pieces of elastic that are the same length. Now what you're going to want to do very carefully, because this elastic is very narrow, so it's sort of difficult to pin, is you're going to want to decide how this is going to go through your machine so that you have pinned it in the right direction. And you want to pin on the wrong side of your fabric. And you're just going to pin along one edge, the front edge to the back edge, and pin. Like I said, it's sort of tricky because this elastic is so narrow. Alright. And then you're going to want to pin it somewhere right about in the center here. Now you're just pinning to one side. Remember, I just still have it folded over double, right? And so you're going to see this is going to have to stretch a little bit on the front end, and it's going to have to stretch a little bit on the back end to fit. I might shift mine over just a little to get that a little bit more centered, because your back is actually longer than your front, so you don't want it completely centered. Then as you stretch this elastic, you're going to either hold down or somehow figure out, if you have a third person, how to pin that again in the center of this front leg opening. So I'm just sort of going to pinch it about where I think it's going to be. And you're going to line this up right along the edge of the fabric. So you'll see here your fabric is bunched up because your elastic is longer than your fabric. And when you stretch it, it'll line up. You want those edges to line up, so place a couple of more pins. I use a lot of pins when I'm working with elastics because they have a tendency to want to pop or shift, slip on out while I'm sewing them. So I put as many in there as I can sort of fit. So I have 5 just sort of from this front seam to the back, for the front to the center, the middle seam, sorry, the side seam. And I'm going to do the same thing for this back piece. As you can see, I have more fabric than I have elastic. You're going to stretch the elastic and place your pins. I like to start in the center, so you get sort of a halfway point. Pin it. You can pull it and see, split the difference between the middle pin and that pin at the side seam, and then split the difference between the edge of the back seam and that middle seam and place another pin. And now we're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and this time we are going to use a different type of zigzag stitch. And again, once we have this completed, we're going to do it for the other side that we haven't pinned. So we have this side pinned, and then we're going to do this side. Now off to the sewing machine. So now, like I said, what we're going to do is change up our zigzag stitch a little. You are going to want to change it to your zigzag stitch. For me, that's stitch 3. And then you're going to want a fairly wide zigzag stitch. So you're going to, before we had our lightning bolt sort of going like this, for those of us that don't have a serger, in a little bit of a narrow pattern. And now we want a much wider zigzag pattern and shorter. So you're going to change that stitch width to a wider number, like 3 or 3.5, depending on how wide your elastic is. And then you're going to want to shorten the stitch maybe down to a 2 or 2.5. Now, a trick with sewing with elastics is, if your machine has this option, make sure that you press that needle position button. See if I can zoom in some. So I have it set to my zigzag stitch, which is stitch number 3. I have it fairly wide at 3 or 3.5, but fairly short at 2 or 2.5, okay? And if you have this needle position button, which I have on my Singer Stylist, the 7258 model, is you're going to put that on so that every time you stop and lift your foot off the pedal, your needle will be down into your fabric. If you don't have this button, then what you can do is just turn the hand crank to make sure that it stops with the needle down into the fabric and not up. The reason why you want to do this is so things don't shift as maybe you're taking a pause or adjusting as you're sewing. So you're going to want to get at the edge of where your zigzag stitch will start and put that presser foot down on top of your fabric, securing it. Then you're going to want to twist your hand crank to you so that you can start in the fabric, so when you remove this pin, everything doesn't slip. Okay, now you're keeping this elastic, I hope you can see, you're keeping this elastic close to the edge of this fabric. So I'm keeping this white elastic very close to the edge of this knit fabric, but I don't want it to go over it. So you can have a little peeking through, but you want it to be almost exactly parallel to the edge. And now you're just going to start zigzagging along this seam. I'm actually going to go for a wider stitch of 4 because that was not wide enough for me. While you're sewing this, you're not going to stretch the fabric, but you are going to pull on the elastic gently to keep it taut so that the elastic meets the length that you're trying to sew over your fabric. So I'm just going to continue on with a little bit wider stitch. You'll see that every time I stop, my needle stays down into my fabric, and that's because I pressed this button on my machine. We're just going to keep going, keeping it right along the edge without poking myself, hopefully. I'm going to lengthen this stitch a tad because I'm impatient. There we go. That's going a little faster. Now be careful going over this side seam. Slow down a little. And then we can keep moving. See how I'm having a little bit of extra fabric here, so you got to keep pulling and stretching that elastic. You can help it through from the back with your other hand as well. Being careful not to prick yourself with the needles. Getting this last bit attached, this can be sort of tricky, so just try to hold it while keeping your fingers out of the way. And I'm going to do a little back stitch here to make sure everything stays in place. Alright, So now, because I have this button down, which I just cut off, it stopped in the down position, so I'm just going to hand crank it to up, pull my thread out the back. Now you'll be able to see that wider zigzag stitch that I made to attach the elastic to the leg opening. Come on, focus. There we go. Alright, so now you can see this wide zigzag seam along this leg edge. Alright, that's better. Okay, you can see it's a little wobbly because I didn't keep it exactly parallel, but you're not going to be able to see this stitch, so it doesn't matter quite as much. Now the next step on the same leg opening that we're going to do is going to be to fold over this edge so that you cannot see the elastic. So you're just going to fold it over like this all the way along. That's why, like I said, when you were feeding it through, if your knit fabric went just slightly beyond the elastic, it was fine, but you wanted it to be close to the edge. Now we're going to feed this back through the machine using the same zigzag stitch or serger if you have it, and we're going to fold this over and encase that elastic all the way down. Same thing, you're going to try to keep it a little taut without seriously pulling. So you just want to keep it taut enough that it lays flat. And we're going to use that same zigzag stitch. Now you can do this with the top side facing the machine so that you can see where your edge is here, or you can flip it over the other way and just sort of use your fingers to feel where that edge should be. It'll be a little bit cleaner if you keep your top up so your bobbin thread goes on the bottom, but again, this is a bodysuit, so it will be under something. You won't be able to see it. I'm going to change my needle back to the stay down setting with that needle position button, and now I'm going to feed this through once again. Going a little slow at the start to get it going. Now you can go all out. I'm just using my fingers to feel where the elastic edge is to fold it over. Going a little slower over this side seam to make sure it doesn't get caught up on that thicker fabric. So again, I'm just feeling underneath to make sure that this edge is folded over right at the edge of the elastic, using these fingers to hold it in place, and I am keeping everything with a little bit of tautness by tugging a little bit towards me. Now the edge, the end of course is tricky like I said before, but you're just going to keep it folded over. Back stitch. And now we're going to roll this hand crank forward if you had it set on needle down. And once you pull it out, you'll have this nice finished seam. With the zigzag stitch that captured the elastic that you had attached to the wrong side. So now you have this nice edge, like a bathing suit edge, along the side leg opening. Alright, so we're just going to repeat that to the other side. If you haven't already, you're going to take your elastic, you're going to pin it to the wrong side of that other leg opening. Then you're going to run it through the machine with a wide but short zigzag stitch. Then you're going to take that elastic seam that's on the wrong side, face it, fold it over, and then go over it again with that zigzag stitch. The same exact thing that we did to the first side. So now that you've attached your elastic to your leg opening on the briefs of your bodysuit, we're going to go ahead and finish off the brief portion by adding the snap so you can have the closure for your briefs. The first thing that you're going to want to do is have some twill tape out, and I don't have any on hand, but I have some bias tape that we're going to pretend like it's twill tape. Do not use bias tape. Bias tape has stretch. You want twill tape so it'll be a nice secure, almost like interfacing to help hold that high stress area into place so it doesn't come apart. So you're going to want to use twill tape. And on the right side of both the front and the back of the briefs, you're going to want to cut a piece, which I've already cut, that's about the width of the edge there for the bottom center of your crotch, okay? And then you're going to sew along this edge, not the edge of your raw edge, but along this inside edge. You're going to do the same thing for the bottom. You're going to cut a strip of twill tape that's the width of the bottom crotch. You're going to sew along that inside, not that outside edge. Once you've done that, so let's pretend like that's sewn on here, you're going to fold this over about 5/8. Now you should have a notch on your pattern, and 5/8 is the width of your twill tape. So you're just going to fold that over, and then you're going to sew along that raw edge of the end of the crotch piece there. And that will keep this sewn down, fold over, and clean looking from the outside. You'll do that to the bottom as well. You would have sewn it to the right side, and then you're going to fold in to the wrong side, and then you're going to sew and encapsulate that raw edge there. Once you've done that, you can attach your snaps. You can use the kind of snaps that you sort of clamp on with that hand clamp, or you can use sew-on snaps. Either way, you're going to place 3, 2 at the outside edge and 1 in the center. We'll go over that right when I get back over to the sewing machine. But you can use these that pop off that are hand sewn, and just make sure you keep the male on one side and the female side on the other side so that you can have your snaps going in the right direction. Now, I'm not actually going to be doing either one of those in this video. I've been fortunate enough at my local fabric warehouse, Find Fabrics in Duluth, which is outside of Atlanta, to find these snaps that are already on twill tape, which I think is great because it saves me a step. I have the male side on this single row, and then the female side is on this double row. So you could actually cut just a piece of this off and stitch this directly to the front or back of the pattern of the briefs, and then you'll take the male side and put it on the other side. Therefore, when you fold it up, you can just snap it, and then if that's not tight enough, you can snap it on the higher one. And I like these, like I said, because it's just easier. It's already attached. I don't have to worry about hand stitching or clamping on those snaps. Now, I will try to find out what this is called and where else you can purchase it from for those of you who are not in the Atlanta area. I'm sure there's somewhere that you can order this online. I will try to find it for you and provide a link. But that's how I finish off my bodysuits, is with this tape. I just cut it to the right length and then go ahead and attach it. So now let's move back over to the sewing machine. I have this cotting shirting from another project that I'm going to be working on next. This should actually be my next sew along video. But since I don't have any twill tape, what I'm going to use is actually going to be this selvage edge of this cotting shirting so that I can have a nice stable base for my snaps. Like I said, I'm not really going to need this since I'm going to use the twill tape with the pre-made snaps that I have. But just to show you what this step is, we're going to cut a piece of this selvage edge, which is nice and stable, to add that stability to the bodysuit. I've already cut a piece that is the right width here. So what we're going to do is line this up and sew along this inside edge. So you can pin it if that helps you to keep it in place for this short distance. And then you're going to place the inner edge of this twill tape right under the needle under your presser foot. Now you're probably going to be sewing through that edge of the elastic, so you want to take it nice and slow. Maybe start with a few hand cranks to get it started. Make sure you back stitch, and then you're just going to sew along that edge. And then back stitch at the end. Looks like I actually cut my piece a tad too short, but you can see that I've sewn along the edge here. Okay, so now we're just going to fold this over to the inside or the wrong side of the fabric and sew along that side of the twill tape that you didn't just sew. Again, it might be a little tricky with the elastic, so get it under your purser foot as best that you can. Start with your hand crank for a couple of stitches just to get it started. Back stitch, and then sew. Back stitching at the end. Now let me clear away some of these loose threads. Loose threads drive me crazy. All right, so now you have that attached on both sides. So now you have your twill tape sewn to the wrong side, or the inside of both your front and your back brief pieces. Now, once this is done, you can go ahead and attach your snaps, whether that's going to be your sew-on snaps, your clamp-on snaps, or if you've been able to find some of these cute little ribbon snaps that I have. Okay, when you do this, it doesn't really matter if you use your female or your male side per se, but you're going to want to take one side of your snaps and attach it to the wrong side of the front. You know this is the front because it's the shorter piece, so you're going to want to attach it to the wrong side. Right over that twill tape that you've already sewn on is where you're going to attach one side of your snaps. So you're going to have that attached like so, and then you're going to either hand sew, clamp it, or I'm going to stitch around this tape. Then on the bottom, you need to put your snaps on the right side. So see how this is the opposite side where the twill tape was attached. You're going to want to place it on the outside of your fabric, the right side. So once you have that pinned, the front can fold over the back and snap right into place. So go ahead and attach that however your snap instructions tell you to attach it. If you're doing individual snaps, attach 3. You're going to put 2 on each side and just place 1 in the center. Do the same thing for the other side, and then you'll be ready to snap it shut. So I have my snaps attached. I've attached them to the wrong side of the front and the right side of the back. So you can see now it will snap properly as a bodysuit should. So these are your briefs. So now we have our bodice sewn and we have our briefs sewn. So now it's time to attach the two to create the bodysuit. The easiest way for me to do this is to turn the bodice inside out. So now your right side is facing inward. Find the back. This is the front because I don't see the seam. This is the back because here's the seam in the neckband. You can see that seam in the neckband there. So this is the back of your bodice. And you're going to take the back of your briefs, which is the longer piece, so the piece that hangs down longer, the piece that has the snap sewn to the outside, and you're going to take it, so here's your back, you're going to slide it into the back of the bodice, and you're going to pin. You're going to line up those double notches, and you're going to pin, and then you're going to pin at the side seam, right side's facing, then you're going to pin at the opposite side seam, then you're going to go ahead and make sure you put the briefs completely inside of the bodice so they fit down on the inside, and then you're going to pin the front at the double notches. So now you have 4 pins. You have a pin at each side, the center front and the center back. Your bodice, to have that blouson effect, is going to be looser. You can see it hanging here than the briefs because your briefs are going to be more fitted. So you're just going to stretch the briefs so that they match the length of the bodice and pin. that's how you get that blouson, blousy, almost gathered effect. So you can place a pin there, and you're going to do this for each one of the quadrants. So while I'm on another quadrant, I'm going to place another pin, move to the front, stretch it, sort of pinch it, pin it, and then one more time, stretch it, get it the same length, pinch it, pin it. So now you have your bodice equally spaced to stretch around the briefs. So now we're going to take this to either our sewing machine or our serger and sew all the way around this circumference at the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I know some of you aren't going to have a serger in your sewing space, and I understand that. I didn't for a while have one either, but I wanted to show this final sort of seam on the serger just for those people who may have one. I find it easier to serge this edge, and if not though, you can use your sewing machine zigzag stitch like we've been doing for the rest of the project for this seam, because it will be a stress seam. So you just pick anywhere that you want to start. I always like to match my serger thread to the piece that I'm working on. That's not necessary though. You can really use any color. It won't be seen from the outside for this particular project. So I just have 4 red threads, but you could do whatever you need to do. And I'm going to try to zoom in really close. A lot of people I've seen have had this question in the past. There are seam allowance guides on your serger. Mine's really dirty, sorry. This really bold line that you have here is the 5/8. The one to the left of that is a 1/2 inch, and the one to the left of that is 3/8. The one that's to the right of the bold 5/8 line is a 1 inch line. So what we're going to want to do, because this pattern calls for a 1/2 inch seam allowance, is you're going to line it up against this second notch, the second line. And I'm going to keep my blade on, which you turn on the side, to trim off the excess. So you're just going to get it in. And a lot of people also wonder about serging in circles, so this will demonstrate that as well. You're just going to get it started, moving the fabric over to this 1/2 inch line. It's hard to sort of really start it there, so you're just going to start it with your fabric, butt it up against the blade or the foot that you have here, and then you're going to move it over so that it gets to this 1/2 inch seam line. See how I've already shifted it over to that point? Then please make sure you remove your pins as you go, because if sewing over a pin is hard, going over it in the serger is much, much worse. Now I've already played with my tension, so I have everything lined up right, but you always want to check that before you start serging on fabric. Be careful to remove those pins. Keep it taut, because you're trying to stretch that brief fabric to take up the same length as your bodice fabric. So you're going to stretch slightly as you sew along, but making sure that all your notches and your side seams stay lined up. Halfway there almost. Keep those notches lined up. Now I'm almost back to the beginning, and you'll see where I first started, because I couldn't move the fabric over all the way to the 1/2 inch seam allowance when I was starting. You'll see a little jagged jump there. So what you're going to do is you're just going to keep on serging until you sort of serge over where you started, just like when you're sewing in your sewing machine. Now it'll look like this is about to be offline, because again, this is where I started, where I didn't have my fabric all the way over to the 1/2 inch seam allowance. But if you just keep lining everything up, you'll see right about here, you'll line right back up on top of where you started. And then we'll sew right off the fabric. Find my snips. And there you go. You have it perfectly sewn around It's a nice clean edge on your serger. So now we can turn this whole thing right side out. And you have your bodysuit. Let me zoom out. You have your blouse on top, and your briefs are nicely attached. I'm going to show this to you again on the table, but just one more thing so that we can finish off everything. You're going to fold in your sleeve 5/8 of an inch. Now, if you have a serger, you can finish this raw edge on your serger so it's nice and neat. If you have a cover stitch, which I do, I'm probably going to use that to finish off this sleeve. Or if you have a sewing machine, go ahead and finish off with a zigzag stitch if you prefer, and then sew this with a 5/8 inch fold over with that wide zigzag stitch so you have some stretch in your arm. Now, you can use a seam gauge if you have one. Mine's really sort of worn down, to make sure that you keep that even 5/8 of an inch all the way around. Or if you've been sewing long enough, you can probably just sort of eyeball it. You just definitely want to make sure both of your sleeves are the same length. So you're going to do that, and you're going to either use your serger to do the raw edge, and then you can do a wide zigzag stitch, a stretch stitch, or you can use a double stitch if you have a twin needle to clean off this edge. I recommend a zigzag stitch if you just have a sewing machine, because I found that it's easier. But if you have a cover stitch machine, this would be a great time to pull that out to do that edge. And once you finish off both sleeves, you're done. So now that you have attached your briefs to your bodysuit, you have a complete bodysuit. You have your briefs with your snaps that's going to snap right there under your crotch, and you have this blouson effect bodysuit attached with your raglan sort of dolman style sleeves. I haven't finished off my hems yet for my sleeve because I haven't pulled out my cover stitch, but here you are. You're all done. I'll also go ahead and add my tag, my label that I was talking about earlier inside here as well, because I just think it gives it that nice finished look if you have labels. And this is the bodysuit. Pretty simple, right?